My daughter-in-law had an affair with my husband a week before he died, and the strangest part is that when I finally learned the truth, I didn't cry, I didn't scream, I simply poured myself a cup of tea and smiled as if nothing had changed, because by then, everything already had. The afternoon light filtered through my kitchen window the same way it had for the past 32 years, warm and familiar, touching the edges of the oak table where I had served thousands of meals, where birthdays were celebrated and quiet apologies were exchanged, where I believed, perhaps foolishly, that love lived permanently. But that day the house felt different, not broken, not loud, just hollow, like a place that had quietly decided it no longer belonged to me. My husband, Richard, had been gone for exactly 6 days. 6 days since I stood beside a polished casket in a navy dress that still smelled faintly of his cologne. 6 days since neighbors shook my hand and said words they didn't mean. 6 days since my son avoided my eyes and my daughter-in-law, Claire, held my arm just a little too tightly, as if she were rehearsing grief instead of feeling it. Grief, I've learned, is not always loud. Sometimes it is quiet and observant, sitting in the corner of the room and watching everyone else reveal who they really are. That morning had started like all the others since the funeral, slow and careful. I measured out my coffee grounds with steady hands. I wiped down a counter that was already clean. I folded a dish towel twice before placing it exactly where it belonged. These small rituals were the only things that still felt real. Everything else felt like a performance I hadn't agreed to be part of. Claire had called earlier, her voice soft, almost too soft, asking if she could come by to check on me, and I said yes, of course, because that's what I had always said. Yes to helping, yes to giving, yes to believing that family meant something permanent, something unbreakable. When she arrived, she wore a cream sweater and a smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. She stepped into my home like she had been practicing how to belong there, like she was already imagining where her furniture would go, and I noticed things I had ignored before. The way she glanced at the hallway mirror, adjusting her hair as if preparing for an audience. The way she moved through the kitchen with a familiarity that felt earned, but not by me. We sat across from each other at the table, the same table where I had once taught her how to make apple pie, where she had called me Mom, in a voice so sweet it almost convinced me it was real. And for a moment, there was silence, the kind that stretches just long enough to make you aware that something is about to shift. You should start thinking about what comes next, she said gently, folding her hands as if she were offering advice instead of laying groundwork, and I nodded, because I had already begun thinking about what came next, just not in the way she expected. It wasn't until later that afternoon, after she left, that the truth arrived, not with drama, not with raised voices, but with a quiet knock on my door and a woman I hadn't seen in years standing on my porch, her expression careful, almost apologetic. She introduced herself as someone who used to work with Richard, someone who had debated for days whether to come, someone who finally decided that I deserved to know. I invited her in, offered her tea, and sat down across from her once again at that same table, only this time the air felt heavier, like the room itself was bracing for something. She spoke slowly, choosing each word with precision, and as she did, pieces of my life began rearranging themselves in my mind. Small moments I had dismissed, late nights at the office, unfamiliar cologne, the way Claire and Richard had once shared a glance that lingered just a second too long, and suddenly, it all made sense, not in a loud, explosive way, but in a quiet, devastating clarity. When she finished, she looked at me as if expecting something, tears perhaps, or anger, but I simply nodded, thanked her for telling me, and walked her to the door. When the house was quiet again, I returned to the kitchen, filled the kettle, and waited for it to boil, because there is a certain kind of strength that comes from not reacting immediately, from allowing the truth to settle, from understanding that some battles are not won in the moment they are revealed, but in the silence that follows. I sat down, wrapped my hands around a warm cup, and for the first time since the funeral, I felt something steady inside me, not grief, not even anger, but clarity, and as I stared at the empty chair across the table, I realized something they had both underestimated. I was not as unaware as they believed, and I was certainly not as powerless as they hoped. The next morning arrived with a quiet stillness that felt almost rehearsed, as if the house itself was waiting to see what I would do now that I knew, and I moved through my routine with the same careful precision, pouring my coffee, opening the curtains, letting the pale sunlight settle across the hardwood floors. But everything felt sharper now, every detail carrying a weight it had not held before, because once you see the truth, even the smallest things begin to speak. Richard's study door stood slightly open, something he never did, He was always particular about closing it, about keeping his papers in perfect order, and for a moment I stood there in the hallway, my hand resting lightly against the frame, remembering how many evenings I had brought him a cup of coffee, how many times I had knocked gently before stepping inside, as if I were the guest in a space that should have belonged to both of us. I pushed the door open slowly and stepped in, the air still carrying a faint trace of his aftershave, the desk exactly as he had left it, neat, deliberate, controlled, and yet now it felt like a stage set, something arranged to look truthful but hiding something underneath. I sat down in his chair, something I had never done before, and for a moment I allowed myself to feel the weight of that, the quiet realization that there were parts of his life I had never truly been invited into, and that perhaps he had preferred it that way. I opened the top drawer, expecting nothing, just a habit of curiosity, but inside were small things that did not belong to me, receipts I had never seen, a restaurant I did not recognize, a date that overlapped with a night he told me he was working late, and I paused, not because it shocked me, but because it confirmed what had already begun to settle in my chest, that this was not sudden, not accidental, this had been unfolding quietly, carefully, right under my roof. I closed the drawer gently and leaned back, letting out a slow breath, because anger would have been easy, loud, immediate, but what I felt instead was something colder, something steadier, the kind of clarity that comes when there is nothing left to question. Later that afternoon, my son Daniel called, his voice carrying that same distant politeness he had used at the funeral, asking if I was holding up all right, and I told him yes, because it was easier than explaining the kind of strength that comes from seeing things clearly for the first time. And as he spoke about practical matters, paperwork, timelines, things that sounded responsible but felt rehearsed, I listened carefully, not to what he said, but to what he avoided, the pauses, the careful wording. The way he never once mentioned Claire's visit the day before. When the call ended, I set the phone down and sat there in the quiet, replaying his voice in my mind, and I realized something that settled deeper than anything else. This was not just about two people making a mistake, this was about a pattern. A quiet understanding that had existed without me, decisions being made, plans being formed, all while I believed I was part of something real. I stood up and walked through the house slowly, touching the back of a chair, the edge of a picture frame, the banister I had polished for years, each object holding a memory that now felt slightly altered, like a photograph that had been edited just enough to change its meaning. In the bedroom, I opened the closet and ran my hand along Richard's jackets, still hanging neatly in place. And for a moment I allowed myself to remember the man I thought I knew, the one who had held my hand during long drives, who had fixed things around the house without being asked, who had once told me that everything we built would always be ours, and I realized that memory itself can be honest even when the person is not, that the life we shared had been real to me, even if it had not been complete. I closed the closet door and turned away, because there is a point where looking back no longer serves you, and I had reached it. By evening, the house felt different again, not empty this time, but quieter in a way that felt intentional, and I sat at the kitchen table with a notepad in front of me, writing down small things, dates, names, details that had once seemed unimportant, because now they formed a pattern I could follow, and as I wrote, I felt something shift inside me, not grief, not confusion, but purpose, a calm understanding that whatever had been hidden would not remain that way, not anymore. I placed the pen down carefully and looked around the room one more time, taking in the familiar walls, the soft hum of the refrigerator, the fading light outside the window, and for the first time since everything had come to light, I felt completely steady, because I was no longer trying to hold on to what had been, I was preparing for what would come next, and they still believed I was the same woman who would accept whatever was handed to her, who would remain quiet, who would not question, and that belief, more than anything else, would be their greatest mistake. 2 days later, Claire returned, this time without calling first, and I heard the front door open with a familiarity that would have unsettled me before, but now I simply set down the dish I was drying and turned slowly, allowing myself a moment to observe rather than react, because observation had become my greatest advantage. She stepped into the kitchen with that same practiced softness, carrying a small bag of groceries as if she were performing a role she had memorized, placing it gently on the counter and offering a smile that was meant to appear comforting. But now I could see the calculation behind it, the subtle way her eyes moved around the room, measuring, assessing, as though she were already deciding what belonged to her and what did not. I thought you might need a few things, she said, her voice light, almost cheerful, and I nodded, thanking her with the same calm tone I had always used, because there is power in consistency, in giving. Nothing away. She lingered longer than necessary, opening cabinets, rearranging items that did not need to be touched, and I noticed how easily she moved through the space, as if the boundaries that once existed had quietly dissolved, and I wondered how long that shift had been happening without me seeing it. We sat at the table again, the same table that had become the silent witness to everything unfolding, and she began talking about practical matters, the house, the future, what would be easier for me now, her words wrapped in concern but carrying an undercurrent of direction, as if she were guiding me toward a conclusion I had not yet agreed to. I listened carefully, not interrupting, letting her speak, because people often reveal more when they believe they are in control, and she spoke about maintenance costs, about how difficult it would be for me to manage everything alone, about how Daniel and she had been discussing options, the word "we" appearing again and again in her sentences, a quiet indication that decisions were already being formed somewhere beyond my reach. I asked a simple question then, one that seemed harmless on the surface, asking when these discussions had started, and for the first time, she hesitated, just briefly, but enough for me to see the gap between what she wanted me to believe and what was actually true. "Oh, just recently," she replied, smoothing her sleeve as she spoke, and I nodded again, because I had already begun to understand that the timeline she was offering did not match the one I was uncovering. After she left, I did not sit down right away. Instead, I walked back into Richard's study, closing the door behind me this time, something I had not done before, and I opened the lower drawer of his desk, the one he rarely used, and inside were documents that felt heavier than paper should, property records, financial statements, notes written in his careful handwriting, and among them, something that made me pause, a draft of a document, incomplete but clear enough in its intention, outlining changes that would have altered everything, shifting ownership, redefining what belonged to whom, and suddenly the conversations Claire had been having made sense in a way that was no longer abstract. I sat there for a long moment, holding those pages, not with shock, but with a growing certainty, because this was not about grief or confusion, this was about control, about positioning, about ensuring that when the time came, everything would already be arranged. I placed the papers back exactly as I found them, closing the drawer carefully, because moving too quickly would only alert them, and I had no intention of doing that. That evening, Daniel stopped by unexpectedly, his knock softer than usual, as if he were unsure of his place here, and when I opened the door, I saw something in his expression that I had not noticed before, not guilt exactly, but discomfort, the kind that comes from standing too close to something you do not want to fully acknowledge. We sat in the living room, the television off, the quiet between us stretching in a way that felt familiar and foreign at the same time, and he spoke about small things at first, work, errands, the usual details that fill space without saying anything real, and then, gradually, he began to circle back to the same topics Claire had mentioned, the house, the future, what would be best for me, his words echoing hers in a way that was too precise to be coincidence. I watched him as he spoke, noticing how he avoided certain phrases, how he chose his words carefully, and I realized that whatever had been planned, it had been discussed more than once. Rehearsed even, until it sounded natural. I responded with the same calm I had maintained all along, agreeing where it cost me nothing, asking questions that seemed simple but allowed me to see more clearly, and when he left, thanking me for being understanding, I closed the door gently and stood there for a moment, listening to the silence settle back into place. The house no longer felt hollow, it felt watchful, as if it were holding its breath alongside me, and as I walked back to the kitchen, I understood something with absolute clarity. They believed they were guiding me toward a decision, shaping the outcome before I could question it, but what they did not realize was that I had already begun shaping something of my own, something quieter, something far more deliberate, and by the time they understood what was happening, it would already be too late for them to change it. That night, I did not turn on the television, I did not reach for a book, I simply sat in the dim light of the living room and let the silence settle around me, because silence had become the place where everything made sense. The house, once filled with the steady rhythm of a shared life, now revealed its quieter truths, and as I looked around, I began to see not just what had happened, but how long it had been happening, how carefully it had been hidden beneath ordinary days and familiar routines. I closed my eyes for a moment and let my mind move backward, not in a rush, but slowly, deliberately, as if I were walking through rooms I had not visited in years, and there they were, the small moments that once felt insignificant, now aligning with a clarity that felt almost unsettling. I remembered a dinner from nearly a year ago, Claire laughing a little too easily at something Richard had said, her hand resting on the table just close enough to his that it could have been accidental, and I had dismissed it then, telling myself that I was imagining things, that I was tired, that trust meant not questioning every glance, every gesture. I remembered the business trips that had become more frequent, the explanations that were always reasonable, always just detailed enough to avoid suspicion, and how I had accepted them without hesitation, because for decades, that was what I had done. I had trusted, I had believed, I had chosen not to look too closely at anything that might disturb the peace I thought we had built. There was a Sunday afternoon when Claire arrived earlier than Daniel, saying she wanted to help me prepare dinner, and I had welcomed her into the kitchen, showing her where everything was, explaining recipes I had perfected over years, and now I could see how easily she had observed, learned, and moved within my space, not just physically, but in ways I had not understood at the time. I stood up and walked slowly into the hallway, pausing by the family photographs that lined the wall, images of birthdays, holidays, vacations, moments frozen in time that once felt solid and certain, and I studied them now with a different awareness, noticing how often Claire stood just a little closer than necessary, how often Richard's expression shifted when he thought no one was paying attention, subtle changes that meant nothing on their own but everything when placed together. I reached out and adjusted one of the frames, straightening it slightly, and the simple act felt symbolic, as if I were beginning to realign something that had been tilted for far too long. Returning to the kitchen, I opened a drawer where I kept old letters and cards, things I had saved over the years without much thought, and I found one from Richard, written on our 30th anniversary, his handwriting steady, his words warm, promising that everything we had built would always be ours. And I read it carefully, not with bitterness, but with a quiet understanding that people can mean what they say in one moment and still become someone else in another. I folded the letter and placed it back exactly where it belonged, because I was not trying to erase the past, I was trying to understand it fully, without illusion. As the hours passed, I continued to piece together the timeline, not through dramatic revelations, but through the accumulation of details. A late-night message I had once glimpsed on his phone, the way Claire had begun calling more frequently when Daniel was not home, the subtle shift in how decisions were discussed, how I had gradually been moved from the center of conversations to the edges without even realizing it. It was not one moment, not one decision, but a series of small choices, repeated quietly, consistently, until they formed something undeniable. I sat down again at the table, my hands resting calmly in front of me, and I allowed myself to acknowledge the truth in its entirety, not just the betrayal itself, but the structure around it, the planning, the patience, the assumption that I would never see it clearly enough to respond. And that was when something settled firmly inside me, not a surge of anger, not a wave of sadness, but a steady, grounded resolve, because understanding changes everything. It removes hesitation, it removes doubt, it replaces uncertainty with direction. I stood up, walked to the window, and looked out at the quiet street, the familiar houses, the stillness of the evening, and for the first time since all of this began to unfold, I did not feel like someone reacting to events beyond my control. I felt like someone who had finally seen the full picture, someone who could choose what came next with complete awareness. Behind me, the house remained silent, but it no longer felt like a place where things were hidden. It felt like a place where everything had already been revealed, and as I turned away from the window and reached for my notebook once more, I understood that this was no longer about discovering what had happened. It was about deciding what I would do with that knowledge, and I was no longer willing to be the last person to understand what was unfolding in my own life. The following morning, I woke before the sun had fully risen, not because I had slept well, but because my mind had finally settled into something steady, something focused, and as I lay there for a moment, listening to the quiet hum of the house, I realized that the confusion had passed, leaving behind a clarity that felt almost unfamiliar. I got up without hesitation, moving through my morning routine with a sense of purpose that had not been there before, measuring my coffee, opening the curtains, letting the soft light fall across the same kitchen that had witnessed so much. But now I was no longer simply existing within it, I was preparing within it. I took out my notebook again, the one I had begun filling with small details, and I reviewed what I had written, dates, patterns, conversations, not as a list of grievances, but as a map, something I could follow without losing my direction. The decision I had reached was not dramatic, not loud, it was simple and precise. I would not confront them, not yet, because confrontation would only give them the chance to adjust, to hide, to reshape the narrative in ways that would leave me reacting instead of leading, and I had no intention of doing that. Instead, would remain exactly who they believed me to be, calm, trusting, unaware, because that version of me gave them confidence, and their confidence made them careless. Later that morning, I made a phone call, one I had not anticipated needing to make but now felt entirely necessary, and when the voice on the other end answered, familiar and professional, I introduced myself calmly, explaining that I needed to review certain documents, that I wanted to ensure everything was in order, my tone steady, my words measured, because I understood that how you ask matters just as much as what you ask. The conversation was brief but informative, enough to confirm that there were details I had not been fully included in, adjustments that had been discussed but not finalized, and that confirmation settled something inside me even further, because uncertainty had been replaced with direction. When I hung up, I did not rush, I did not react outwardly, I simply placed the phone down and stood there for a moment, allowing myself to absorb the significance of what I now knew, that the situation was not only emotional, it was structured, intentional, and that meant it could be understood, and anything that can be understood can be addressed. In the afternoon, Claire called again, her voice carrying that same gentle tone, asking if I had thought more about what she and Daniel had mentioned, about what might be best moving forward, and I responded with the same calm agreement I had used before, telling her that I appreciated their concern, that I was considering everything carefully, and I could almost hear the satisfaction in her silence, the assumption that things were unfolding as she expected. After the call, I stood by the window, watching a car pass slowly down the street, and I thought about how easily people mistake quiet for weakness, how often they assume that if someone does not react immediately, they are unaware, when in reality, silence can be the most deliberate choice of all. I spent the rest of the day moving through the house with intention, not in a way that would draw attention, but in a way that allowed me to see everything clearly, opening drawers, reviewing files, noting what belonged where, understanding the structure of what had been built over the years, not just emotionally, but practically, because this was no longer just about what had happened, it was about what would happen next. In the evening, I sat once more at the kitchen table, the same place where so many decisions had been made, and I wrote down a simple plan, not elaborate, not complicated, just clear steps, things that needed to be confirmed, people that needed to be spoken to, details that needed to be secured, and as I wrote, I felt that same steady sense of control growing stronger, because I was no longer reacting to what they were doing, I was preparing for what I would do. I closed the notebook gently and placed it in front of me, my hands resting on either side of it, and I allowed myself a small, quiet smile, not out of satisfaction, but out of understanding, because they believed they were guiding me toward an outcome that benefited them. They believed I would follow the path they had outlined, and they were not entirely wrong. I would follow it, but not in the way they expected, not to the place they had chosen, but to one of my own making, and by the time they realized the difference, the direction would already have changed beyond their control. The next day, I did something I had not done in years. I left the house not out of necessity, but with intention, choosing a time when the streets were quiet and the morning air still carried that early coolness that makes everything feel sharper, clearer, and as I locked the door behind me, I paused for just a moment, not out of hesitation, but to acknowledge that I was stepping into something new, something that required more than patience. It required precision. I drove across town slowly. Not because I did not know the way, but because I was allowing myself to think through each step carefully, reviewing what I needed to confirm, what I needed to understand, and what I needed to secure before anything else could unfold. When I arrived, the building looked exactly as it always had, solid, professional, unremarkable in a way that made it reliable, and I walked inside with the same calm composure I had carried with me for days, greeting the receptionist with a polite smile, giving my name without urgency, because urgency raises questions, and I had no intention of raising any. The meeting itself was straightforward, the kind that would seem ordinary to anyone observing from the outside, but every word mattered. Every clarification added another piece to the structure I was quietly building, and as documents were reviewed and explained, I listened carefully, asking only what was necessary, confirming details without revealing how much I already knew, because knowledge, when held quietly, is far more powerful than when it is displayed. There were discrepancies, small ones at first glance, adjustments that had been suggested but not finalized, signatures that had been discussed but not completed, and I noted each one mentally, understanding that timing was everything, that what had not yet been finalized could still be directed, reshaped, secured in a way that aligned with truth rather than assumption. When the meeting ended, I thanked them with the same steady tone I had used throughout, collected the copies I was entitled to, and walked back outside into the late morning light, feeling not relief, but confirmation, the kind that removes all remaining doubt and replaces it with quiet certainty. On the drive home, I did not turn on the radio. I let the silence accompany me, because silence had become the space where everything aligned, and as I turned onto my street, I noticed Claire's car already parked in the driveway, something that might have unsettled me before, but now simply registered as another detail, another piece of the pattern. When I stepped inside, she was in the kitchen again, standing by the counter as if she had always belonged there, and she looked up with that same composed expression, asking casually where I had been, her tone light, but her eyes attentive, measuring my response, and I answered just as casually, telling her I had taken care of a few things, nothing urgent, nothing worth elaborating on, because the less I offered, the more she would assume. She nodded, accepting the answer, or perhaps choosing to, and began speaking again about plans, about what would be easier, about timelines that sounded increasingly specific, and I listened, allowing her to outline a future she believed was already in motion, because every assumption she made without verification only strengthened my position. Later that afternoon, Daniel joined us, his presence filling the room in a way that felt both familiar and distant, and together they spoke about practical steps, about arrangements that would need to be made, their voices calm, reasonable, almost persuasive, as if they were guiding me gently toward a conclusion that had already been decided, and I responded with the same measured agreement, acknowledging their points, asking questions that seemed simple but allowed me to see how aligned they truly were, how often they glanced at each other for subtle confirmation, how practiced their explanations had become. When they finally left, thanking me again for being so understanding, I walked them to the door with the same composed expression, watching as they stepped into the evening light, confident, assured, completely unaware of the shift that had already taken place beneath the surface. I closed the door quietly and stood there for a moment, my hand resting lightly against the wood, not out of uncertainty, but out of recognition, because the dynamic had changed, not in a way they could see, but in a way that would soon become impossible to ignore. I returned to the kitchen, sat down at the table, and spread out the papers I had brought back with me, reviewing them once more, not because I needed to, but because repetition reinforces clarity, and clarity ensures that when the time comes, there is no hesitation, no second-guessing, only action. I placed everything back into its folder carefully, aligning each page, closing it with deliberate precision, and as I did, I felt that same steady resolve settle deeper within me, because this was no longer about uncovering what had been hidden, it was about ensuring that what came next would be decided by me, not by them, and they still believed they were in control. They still believed they were guiding the outcome. And that belief would hold, right up until the moment it no longer could. After I closed the folder and placed it carefully back into the drawer, I remained seated for a moment longer, my hand resting lightly on the desk, not out of hesitation, but because I understood that what I had just confirmed was no longer a possibility, it was a fact, and facts do not need urgency, they need precision. The house was still in my name, entirely, unchanged, untouched. Despite every conversation Claire and Daniel had been having, despite every assumption they carried into this room, and I allowed myself a single quiet breath, not of relief, but of clarity, because now I knew exactly where I stood, and more importantly, where they did not. When I stepped out of the study and into the hallway, everything felt the same on the surface, the same light falling across the walls, the same silence settling into the corners, but underneath, something had shifted completely. Because I was no longer trying to understand their plan, I was looking at the gap inside it, the place where they believed something had already been secured, when in reality, nothing had. Later that afternoon, Claire arrived again, her movements confident, almost casual, as if she were stepping into a space she had already begun to claim, and she greeted me with that same soft tone, asking how I was feeling, whether I had given more thought to the timeline they had discussed, and I nodded, offering her the same calm response, telling her that I had been thinking carefully, that I agreed it was important to move forward without unnecessary delay, and I saw it immediately, the way her posture relaxed just slightly, the way her eyes softened with quiet satisfaction, because agreement, even a simple one, is often all it takes to confirm what someone already wants to believe. She moved into the kitchen, placing her bag on the counter, beginning to speak again about next steps, about how quickly things could progress now that everything was lining up. And I listened, not interrupting. Because every word she used revealed something more, not about what had been done, but about what she assumed had been done, and there is a difference between those two things that most people do not notice until it is too late. Daniel joined us shortly after, his tone steady, his confidence now fully formed, as if the uncertainty he once carried had been replaced by a belief that everything was under control, and together they spoke about the house not as something uncertain, but as something already transitioning, referencing future arrangements, discussing what would happen once it was no longer in my hands, and I felt a brief, almost imperceptible pause inside me, not doubt, not fear, but recognition, because hearing them speak so confidently about something that had never actually changed made their entire plan visible in a way nothing else could. For a moment, I considered saying something, correcting them, asking a simple question that would unravel everything they believed, but I did not, because correction would only create caution, and caution would slow them down, and I needed them to move forward. Exactly as they were, certain, unguarded, unaware. Instead, I asked a different question, one that seemed practical, asking how soon they thought everything could be finalized, and Claire answered without hesitation, outlining a timeline that was both ambitious and revealing, because it showed not only what they intended to do, but how confident they were that nothing stood in their way. I nodded again, acknowledging her plan, reinforcing the belief that I was aligned with it, and that belief, more than anything else, kept them from looking any closer. When they left that evening, their steps were lighter, their voices carrying a quiet ease that had not been there before, and as I closed the door behind them, I stood there for a moment, my hand resting against the wood, feeling that same steady calm settle into place, because everything they believed had already happened had not, and everything that had actually happened was something they had not even considered. I walked back into the kitchen slowly, sitting down at the table, the same place where they had just mapped out a future that no longer existed in the way they imagined, and I placed my notebook in front of me, opening it to the page where I had written down the details that mattered, the confirmations, the protections, the facts that could not be changed by assumption or intention. I ran my finger lightly along one line, then another, not because I needed to remember them, but because I understood the weight they carried, because while Claire and Daniel were building their plan on what they believed to be true, I was standing on what actually was. And there is a difference between belief and reality that only reveals itself at the very end. I closed the notebook gently and leaned back in my chair, allowing myself a small, quiet moment of stillness, because the next phase would not require observation anymore, it would require timing, and timing, like everything else, depends on knowing exactly when not to speak, exactly when to let things unfold, and exactly when to allow the truth to reveal itself without interference. And they were moving forward now, confident, assured, completely unaware that the foundation they were standing on had never existed at all. They believed the timeline had already begun, and in a way, it had, just not the one they imagined. The following morning, I woke with the same steady clarity, the kind that does not rush, the kind that does not second-guess, and I moved through my routine without distraction, because everything now depended on maintaining exactly what they expected to see, nothing more, nothing less. Claire arrived earlier than usual that day, her energy different, sharper, as if she were already stepping into a role she believed was nearly hers, and she carried another set of documents, thinner this time, more precise, the kind that suggests final steps rather than preparation. She placed them on the table with quiet confidence, explaining that these were simply confirmations, small formalities to keep everything moving smoothly, and I listened, nodding as she spoke, because what she called formalities were, in reality, the last pieces of a structure she believed was already secure. Daniel joined us shortly after, and together they moved through the documents with a rhythm that felt almost rehearsed, pointing, explaining, guiding, their voices calm, their assumptions firm, and I followed along just enough to reinforce that belief, asking a question here, acknowledging a detail there, never resisting, never hesitating, because hesitation invites scrutiny, and scrutiny was the only thing I could not allow. When Claire slid one particular page closer to me, her finger resting lightly on a line she wanted me to notice, I glanced at it briefly, recognizing immediately what it represented, not because it held power, but because it assumed power that did not exist, and for a fraction of a second, I felt the weight of that moment, the understanding that everything they were building rested on something that had never actually changed. I picked up the pen slowly, not out of doubt, but out of awareness, because this was the point where most people react, where most people question, where most people reveal what they know, and I did none of those things. Instead, I signed exactly where it was appropriate to sign, not blindly, not passively, but with the quiet certainty that nothing on that page could alter what had already been secured elsewhere. And as I placed the pen back down, I saw it again, that subtle shift in their expressions, the quiet confirmation that everything was proceeding as expected, the final reinforcement of a belief they had never thought to question. They began discussing next steps almost immediately, their words overlapping with a sense of momentum, speaking about scheduling, about moving forward quickly, about how everything would fall into place now that this part was complete, and I listened without interruption, because what they were describing was no longer something I needed to influence. It was something that would continue on its own until it reached the moment where reality and assumption could no longer align. Later that afternoon, after they left, I gathered the copies they had provided, placing them side by side with my own documents once more, not to compare, but to confirm, and the difference was clear, not in appearance, but in substance, because what they held was based on expectation, and what I held was based on fact. I traced one line lightly with my finger, then another, not because I needed to read them again, but because I understood what they represented, the quiet shift that had already taken place, the control that had already been secured, and I allowed myself a brief pause, not out of hesitation, but out of recognition, because this was the moment where everything had fully separated, their plan continuing forward on one path, mine already completed on another. That evening, as the light faded outside and the house settled into its familiar stillness, I walked through each room once more, not as someone holding on, but as someone acknowledging, understanding that what they believed was about to be taken had never truly been within their reach, and as I returned to the kitchen, placing the documents neatly back into their folder, I felt no urgency, no need to act further, because everything that needed to be done had already been done. All that remained now was time, the quiet unfolding of events they believed they controlled, and the moment, inevitable and precise, when that belief would meet something it could not change. Time moved exactly as they expected it to, steady, predictable, giving them every reason to believe that nothing stood in their way, and I allowed that rhythm to continue without interruption, because the final step does not require force, it requires alignment, the kind that only becomes visible when everything else has already been set in place. A few days later, Claire called again, her voice carrying that same quiet confidence, asking if we could meet one last time to wrap things up, and I agreed without hesitation, my tone even, my words simple, because there was nothing left to prepare, only something left to reveal. When they arrived, they carried themselves differently this time, lighter, more certain, as if they were already stepping into a conclusion they believed had been secured, and Claire placed the final set of documents on the table with a small, satisfied smile, explaining that this was simply the last confirmation, the final step that would allow everything to move forward exactly as planned. Daniel stood beside her, his posture relaxed, his expression calm, and as they spoke, outlining what would happen next, how quickly things could be finalized, how smoothly everything would transition, I listened with the same composed attention I had given them from the beginning, because nothing they were saying required correction, it required timing. When Claire finished, she looked at me expectantly, the pen already placed within my reach, the moment they had been building toward now resting quietly between us. And I picked it up slowly, not out of doubt, but out of awareness, because this was the point where their certainty was at its highest, where their confidence was complete, and that is always when the truth arrives most clearly. I glanced at the page, then back at them, meeting their eyes with the same calm expression they had come to trust, and for a brief second, I saw it, the assumption, the belief that everything had already been decided, and I allowed that belief to remain exactly as it was. I signed where it was appropriate, my movements steady, deliberate, because what they believed this moment represented was not what it actually was, and as I placed the pen back down, Claire exhaled softly, a small release of tension she had been holding without realizing it, and Daniel nodded, his expression confirming what they both thought, that everything was now complete. They began speaking immediately, their voices overlapping with quiet satisfaction, discussing timelines, next steps, arrangements that would follow, their words flowing easily, confidently, because from their perspective, nothing remained uncertain. I listened, offering small acknowledgments, allowing them to continue building their version of what would happen next, because the version they were describing no longer existed in the way they understood it. When they gathered the documents and stood to leave, Claire paused for a moment, placing her hand lightly on the table, looking at me with something that almost resembled gratitude, thanking me for trusting them, for making this easy, and I nodded, returning the same calm acknowledgement, because ease, in this case, had been the most effective choice I could have made. I walked them to the door, watching as they stepped out into the afternoon light, their movements unhurried, their confidence intact, and as the door closed behind them, the house fell into a silence that felt complete, not empty, not watchful, but settled, as if everything had finally aligned. I stood there for a moment, my hand resting lightly against the door, not out of hesitation, but out of recognition, because the moment they believed everything had been secured was the moment everything had already shifted beyond their reach, and I turned slowly, walking back into the kitchen, sitting down at the table where it had all unfolded, the same table that had held their plans, their assumptions, their certainty. I placed my hands calmly in front of me and allowed myself a single, quiet breath, because there was nothing left to adjust, nothing left to confirm. Everything that needed to be done had already been done, not in front of them, not in the moments they believed mattered, but in the quiet decisions made long before they ever realized there was something to question. And now, all that remained was time, the inevitable unfolding of a reality they had never accounted for, a reality that would not need to announce itself, because when it finally appeared, it would not ask for their understanding, it would simply stand there, unchanged, undeniable, and entirely beyond their control.